The coffee went cold while the galaxy rewrote humanity's future. That is how I remember it, not the seal on my screen, not the voice, not the rotating spiral of 17 rings that represented every civilization the council considered worth counting. I remember the coffee sitting 3 in from my left hand, going from hot to lukewarm to something I would never drink, while 43 seconds of transmission ended 11 years of work and patience and carefully swallowed anger. My name is Elena Reyes, Commander, Ambassador, United Earth Diplomatic Corps, 11 years stationed at Orbital Threshold, the narrow platform at the edge of the oldest conversation in the known galaxy, one human seat at a table that had been built without us in mind. I had spent those 11 years earning the right to sit in it. I had negotiated cargo lane boundaries, medical supply routes, and the legal standing of 17 contested moons in the outer transit corridor. I had written formal apologies for things humanity had not done. I had filed inquiries that sat in council archives untouched and unanswered for years at a stretch. I had smiled through insults translated into 6 languages and called myself a diplomat for doing it. I was very good at my job. The transmission opened at exactly 700. Station time, routine council frequency. The one I answered every 3rd morning, with a cup of bad synth coffee and an expression I had practiced so long it had become a second face. The Velhari seal rotated on my screen. That spiral pattern, 17 rings each one. A species that had signed the accord. None of them human. Humanity had observer status. A smaller chair at a table we were to be grateful to sit near, and I had sat in it and done the work anyway, because the work was the only thing that moved anything forward. The arbiter's voice came through the harmonic resonator in 3 tones at once. That is how the Velhari speak when they want their words to carry the weight of permanence. 3 simultaneous tones layered like the universe itself is in agreement with whatever is being said. I had heard it before in formal session openings, in major policy announcements. I had never heard it addressed to me alone. The transmission was 43 seconds long. I checked afterward. It felt longer. It felt like something that should take years to arrive. Something that should come with a warning, a hearing, a process, a conversation. Something that should not fit in 43 seconds. It did not come with a warning. Terra-class civilizations, the arbiter said, his 3-layered voice filling the office like a tide, are hereby reclassified under Galactic Council Resolution 7741 Omega, Category Omega. Existential volatility risk, effective. Upon receipt of this transmission, all human expansion rights are suspended. Pending Council review. All human military development programs are to be placed under direct Council compliance monitor oversight. Mandate enforcement protocols are authorized should non-compliance be detected. This is a binding Council resolution under the authority of the Accord and requires no further deliberation. 43 seconds. I sat with it for a long time. The coffee finished going cold. I turned the word volatility over in my mind the way you turn a stone over to look at what lives underneath. Volatility, like we were a weather system, like 11 years of signed agreements, approved routes, formal apologies, and carefully negotiated provisions meant nothing more than clouds that needed to be managed before They became a storm, like everything humanity had built, and everything it had agreed to, and everything it had given up to earn its seat at that table was simply evidence that the storm was coming. I thought about the Veracruz station. 4,200 people, the council's quarantine decision had sealed the station's supply lines, and 6 weeks later the station was gone. The arbiter's office had filed it. Under acceptable frontier attrition, I had received the notification on a Tuesday morning. I had written down every name. I had submitted a formal inquiry asking for an independent review, a policy correction, and acknowledgement. The inquiry sat in a council archive for 9 years. I had resubmitted it every year on the same date, and every year it sat. I did not allow myself to think about that yet. That door stays closed until you need it open. What I did instead was pull up a secondary screen, open a private internal channel to the lower deck, and call my second in command. Owen Clark answered in 4 seconds. He was 29 years old, from a small town in northern England, and he had a coffee, too. His was still steaming, which told me he had not been awake long. "Owen," I said. My voice sounded exactly the way it always sounded. That surprised me a little. "I need you to pull every procedural counterfiling protocol registered under the Council's own charter, every clause in the dispute resolution framework, every footnote, every review provision and process delay mechanism we have access to. Pull it all." He looked at me through the channel. He was the kind of person whose thinking runs so deep inside that only the finished thought ever shows up on the surface. "How long are we stalling for?" he said. "Not what happened, not are you all right, just how long?" "As long as it takes," I said. "Understood." I closed that channel and opened a second one. Earth frequency, secure band, lowest detectable emission profile, the kind of signal that looks like cosmic background noise to anything not specifically calibrated to receive it. The line connected to one person, Admiral Pete Garner, Earth Combined Defense. I had met him exactly 4 times in person and trusted him completely, which was a short list. "Garner," he said. "I have a question." I said. "If you needed time, how much would you need?" A pause. 3 seconds. 4. "How much can you get us?" 48 hours guaranteed, possibly 72 if I run the full Article 44 response sequencer. Another pause. Shorter. "We are ready when you are." I had not told him what had happened, yet he already knew. That was the moment something settled my chest that I had been waiting 11 years to feel. Earth was not sitting at home hopping for a better summit. Earth was not enduring. Earth had been watching every move the Council made, learning every clause in their charter, building something that the Council had never thought to include in their threat assessment, something quiet and vast and patient in the same way that water is patient when it is deciding which way to move through stone. I closed the channel. I looked at my cold coffee. I thought in the way my grandmother used to say it back in Laredo, in the way that sounds like sweetness and means something else entirely. Bless their hearts. Then I picked up my pen and started filing. The filing was beautiful in its own way, and I want to be clear about that. There is a specific kind of satisfaction in turning an opponent's own rules into walls around them. Every clause the Council had ever written to slow down inconvenient civilizations was now being used as a procedural obstacle in their own path. Every review provision, every scheduling requirement, every footnote that demanded a signed acknowledgement before the next step could proceed. Owen and I built the most elaborate procedural structure the Council's dispute framework had ever been forced to navigate, and we built it entirely out of their own documents. I filed a response of record citing communication irregularities in the transmission format, which opened a mandatory review period under Article 44 of the Accord's dispute resolution framework. I filed a sub-response citing Resolution 2201, which required that any reclassification of a registered observer civilization be preceded by a formal review board hearing. I filed a notice that no such hearing had occurred. I filed a request for the required hearing scheduling timeline. I filed a formal inquiry asking whether the Council's legal review team had certified the transmission as compliant with Accord procedures prior to its issuance. Owen sat across from me in the briefing room handling secondary filings while I ran the primary channel. We did not talk much. When the work is the message, the work carries the conversation. At hour 6 said, "They are going to figure out what we are doing." "Yes," I said. "And then they will bypass the procedural queue." "Yes." "So what is the actual purpose?" He was not being defeatist. He was not afraid. He was genuinely asking the strategic question the way a good second-in-command does, because good second-in-commands are allowed to ask the honest questions that the person in charge is sometimes too deep inside the work to stop and answer. "Every hour I buy," I said, "is an hour Earth uses." "For what?" "I do not know exactly what form it will take," I said, and that was the truth, but Garner said they were ready. "I trust that." "You have worked with Garner 4 times," he said. "Yes. And that is enough to trust him with this." I thought about the 4 meetings, the specific way Garner chose words, not a man who used ready loosely the way some commanders do, meaning mostly ready, meaning we will adapt as we go. Garner was the kind of officer who did not say a thing was finished until it was finished, and when he said it was finished, he meant it from the foundation up. When he said ready, the work had already been done. "Yes," I said, "that is enough." Owen went back to his screen. By hour 14, the Council's procedural response team had identified what I was doing and sent a junior liaison named Smooth River Current, which I found pleasant and unhelpful, to open a priority channel and inform me that my filings were being reviewed for bad faith obstruction under Council Charter. Article 91. I filed a response noting that Article 91 required a preliminary determination of intent before it could be applied, which itself required a formal hearing, which carried a 12-hour minimum scheduling window under Standard Council protocols. Then I filed the request for that hearing scheduling slot. At hour 22, the arbiter himself opened a direct channel. Arbiters do not manage procedural disputes, they sit above them. That is the function of the position. The fact that he was personally opening a channel over a filing dispute meant that something in the Council's internal system had elevated this above routine obstruction. "Ambassador Reyes," he said in his 3-tone voice, "this obstruction is noted. I am not familiar with the obstruction You are referencing, I said. I have been responding to your transmission in accordance with the Accord's dispute resolution framework. If there is a specific article I have misapplied, I am ready to receive a formal correction. Compliance monitors are authorized to begin transit toward your system, he said. I am aware of that. I would note that their transit at standard approach speed requires approximately 46 hours, during which my procedural filings remain active and Earth's formal response period remains open under Article 44. 3 seconds of silence in Velhari. Diplomatic time, 3 seconds is enough. Silence to be intentional. Your obstruction is transparent, he said. I prefer the word process, I said. It is the word your own charter uses. He closed the channel. Owen looked up from his screen. He was doing something with his expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Article 44, he said. It is a real article, I said. I did not construct it, I just used it more aggressively than anyone has before. Because no one needed to before. Correct. We went back to work. At hour 31, a data packet arrived from Garner's office. No voice message, no explanation, just compressed data, clean and quiet. I opened it at 300 station time while Owen slept on a cot in the adjacent room. What I saw on that screen took a moment to process. The merchant fleet was moving, not dramatically, not in any configuration that would trigger the Council's patrol sensors or violate any transit provision, just steadily, consistently. The way a species moves when it has decided where it needs to be and is simply in the process of getting there. Cargo haulers adjusting their routes. Colony vessels rerouting through inner system lanes or processors. Repositioning to new coordinates, fuel. Tankers moving along corridors they were authorized to use. Each one logged, each one filed, each one completely legal under the shipping provisions the Council had approved for human commercial traffic 9 years ago. I pulled up the total count. I pulled it up again. 38,000 vessels. Not warships, not carriers, 38,000. Civilian ships crewed by ordinary people. Moving into position with a precision that had no single command order. Attached to it, the Council had cataloged human military capacity at roughly 400 active combat vessels. That was the number they had used to write resolution. 400 ships, and they had called humanity an existential risk. They had never asked about the other 38,000. They had never asked why a deep space cargo vessel needed structural reinforcement at twice the load requirement for its listed cargo. They had never asked why civilian life support systems were built to sustain 4 times the listed crew count. They had never asked why merchant pilots trained for evasive routing as part of their standard certification. Because those were civilian ships, and no one assesses a species by its civilian ships. I thought about roads in Laredo, every truck, every ordinary vehicle moving through an ordinary day. Then I thought about what happened when something serious came through. How a delivery truck became a supply chain, how a construction crew became a rescue team, how the ordinary machinery of daily life becomes something else entirely when the people operating it decide that it needs to. I wrote one message to Garner. I said, I see them. He wrote back 3 words. He said they all came. Not ordered, not mobilized through a command chain, not authorized by any standing protocol. They all came. 38,000 people who looked at the news and got into their ships. I got up, made a fresh cup of coffee, and went back to filing procedural responses. At hour 47, 13 minutes before the compliance window closed under Article 44, I filed Earth's formal notice of response of record. This triggered the mandatory 72-hour review period before any enforcement action could be legally initiated under the Accord. The Council's team acknowledged the filing in 40 seconds. Then nothing for 6 minutes. 6 minutes when a civilization is accustomed to receiving what it asks for immediately is a different kind of answer. At minute 7, the compliance monitor fleet's positioning report arrived on a secondary channel. 37 capital ships at the edge of the solar system, standard approach formation, the most experienced enforcement fleet in Council history. They had suppressed 8 uprisings across 3 centuries of operation. They had run the traffic count. The Arbiter opened a direct channel 40 seconds after that report reached his desk. He did not speak immediately. Then he said, "Ambassador Reyes, what are those ships?" "Those are our commercial vessels," I said, "operating within Council-approved transit lanes under the shipping rights granted to human civilization in the 2031 Accord. There are 38,000 of them." "There are. Your commercial fleet is not registered at that capacity." "Our commercial fleet registration data," I said, "was last updated 9 years ago. A great deal can change in 9 years. I let him sit with that. Now came the part of this story I have thought about every day since. I had filed for 72 hours and bought 47. Garner had those 47 hours. What 38,000 people chose to do with them was not something I had planned or ordered or even fully understood until I was watching it happen. But what I chose to do with them on the morning of the 3rd day was something I had been thinking about for 9 years. Earth's formal response to Resolution 7741. Omega was not a list of military assets. It was not a threat or a diplomatic protest or a position paper. It was me opening the Council's primary diplomatic channel at exactly 900 station time and beginning to read. Abarca Miguel, age 6, Veracruz. Station. The Arbiter's delegation sat in silence. For a full minute, they assumed it was an opening ritual. Humans have many rituals, and the Velhari had learned patience in navigating them. At name 40, the diplomatic aide sent a soft interrupt. I overrode it and kept reading. Brennan Lewis, age 38, agricultural technician. At name 100, Ferrante Yolanda, age 31, agricultural engineer. The aide tried the channel again with an escalated priority code. I kept reading. At name 214, H. Wang Jesu, age 44, station physician. The Arbiter cut the channel entirely. I reopened it in 14 seconds. The Council's diplomatic architecture was not built with a lock on the outside. No civilization had ever attempted to reopen a channel after the Council cut it. The technical workaround should not have been possible within their system's own authentication protocols. I built it using their own authentication protocols. He cut the channel again. I reopened it in 11 seconds. He cut it a 3rd time. 8 seconds. I was learning his timing. He did not cut it again. I read for 4 hours and 27 minutes, every name, every age, every recorded occupation, doctors and farmers and teachers and pilots and engineers, and a cook named Leonard Mace who had worked on that station for 20 years and whose daughter had written to my office 3 separate times asking for answers I had never been able to give her. I gave her an answer now, not the one she had asked for, but the only one that was left. When I reached the last name, I stopped. The silence on the channel had the kind of weight that silence gets when it is carrying more than sound. I said, Earth's formal response to Resolution 7741. Omega is attached to this transmission. It is 214 pages, 1 page per name from the first 214 people lost on Vera Cruz Station. Each page contains one specific policy, reform addressing the structural failure that made that loss possible. I paused for exactly 1 second. We are not filing an objection, I said. We are filing a replacement. New framework built on the assumption that the Council's purpose is to prevent harm, not to distribute it efficiently among civilizations it considers expendable. Another pause. We will be in touch regarding the review schedule. I closed the channel. My hands were steady. My coffee was cold. Again, Carmen Vass, my communications aide, was standing in the doorway. She was 26, originally from a small town in Wales, and she had been with me for 2 years. She had spent the last 4 hours sitting outside my office door listening through the closed panel in case I needed anything. Her eyes were red at the edges. She was not the kind of person who shows that in front of people, but the edges gave her away. She said, "What happens now?" Now, I said, we find out if they read it. She nodded and turned to leave. Carmen. She stopped. Thank you for staying. She did not say anything. She just nodded once, the kind of nod that is its own full sentence, and walked out. There is something that happens when you read 4,000 names into an open diplomatic channel. It does not happen dramatically. It happens quietly, somewhere inside you while you are in the middle of it, something that has been weighing on you for a very long time settles, not all the way, not permanently, but enough that you can feel the difference between carrying it and not carrying it. And for the first time in years, you understand how heavy it was. I picked up the response document and looked at the first page. Reform Proposal 1, in memory of Abarca. Miguel, age 6. Independent classification review to be conducted by tribunal, not council. Majority vote. 214 proposals. The council had called us a volatility risk. They were right. They had just measured the wrong kind. The council's enforcement fleet was 37 capital ships, and in 200 years of operation, it had never encountered a situation it could not resolve through one of 3 approaches: the display of force, the application of force, or the threat of force directed at parties the target civilization was unwilling to see harmed. 3 methods, 8 successful. Mandate actions, 0 failures. The fleet arrived at the solar system's engagement corridor and standard formation, weapons charged to standby level. Fleet Admiral Leon Grayfield of the Vilhari Officer Corps at its command prepared for one of 3 outcomes. What they found at the corridor was none of the 3. I was not watching the engagement from my station. I was watching the council. Watch the engagement. This was not a battle from the moment Garner wrote. They all came, it had stopped being a battle and become something else. Demonstration, not of weapons, of something the council had never included in its threat assessment because it had not known to look for it. The engagement corridor was 60,000 km wide. Standard approach lane mapped and registered in the Accord's navigation charts, the one the fleet was legally authorized to use under mandate. Protocols, clean, correct, the expected path. Fleet Admiral Grayfield dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the designated entry point and opened his broadcast channel to deliver the compliance demand that had opened every previous mandate action. He looked at his navigation display. He closed his channel. The corridor was filled from edge to edge, not with warships, not with anything. His engagement sensors registered as a military asset, 38,000 civilian vessels, locked in tight formation, cross-linked, in a structural mesh that spans 60,000 km, cargo haulers or processors, colony ships, fuel tankers, agricultural freighters, the full weight of humanity's civilian fleet arranged with a geometric precision that took his tactical computer 4 full seconds to process and classify. 4 seconds is a very long time for a tactical computer. It was a wall, not a figure of speech, a physical wall of civilian metal and human engineering, sitting directly between the enforcement fleet and the inner solar system. Every ship anchor locked, every field cross braced, built from the ordinary machinery of commerce and transport and daily working life. The fleet admiral broadcast the dispersal order on all registered frequencies with escalated authority codes. Nobody moved. He broadcast again. Nobody moved. His intelligence team began running crew identification scans. The results took 11 minutes. Every ship in that formation was crewed. Not automated, not remotely operated. Crewed by people who had filed standard transit documentation, obtained legal approach clearance through normal commercial channels, and locked their ships into position. Under the Accord's War Crimes Charter, firing into civilian vessels was a categorical offense. Every engagement log was automatically broadcast to all registered member species and the 41 non-aligned civilizations monitoring council mandate frequencies at any given time. There were observers watching this corridor from 47 separate systems. He could not fire. He could not proceed. He could not withdraw without filing a mandate failure report that would be on the arbiter's desk within the hour. He sat with those 3 facts. Then his intelligence team sent him the crew manifest analysis. I read Garner's summary report 2 days later. The intelligence team had flagged something in the analysis that they could not find a protocol category for, and Garner had written it up in plain language because he said it needed to be said plainly. The people in that wall had not been mobilized through any command structure. There was no emergency order, no defense core activation, no official request. Each ship had filed its own independent transit application through standard commercial channels and in the purpose field which merchant pilots are required to complete for inner system transit. Almost every application had the same 4 words: not going to watch. Different handwriting, different ships, different ages and backgrounds, and decades of experience, different routes, and different cargo runs and different lives. The same 4 words. Fleet Admiral Grayfield held position at the corridor entrance for 6 hours. He reviewed every available protocol. He consulted with the Arbiter's office. Twice, he ran the engagement analysis against 8 previous mandate actions and found no comparable scenario. There was no doctrine for a civilian wall. There was no protocol for a species that filled a 60,000 km engagement corridor with people who held no military standing, carried no weapons, and wrote, "Not going to watch in the purpose field of a transit form." At hour 6, the enforcement fleet began its withdrawal. Not rooted, not forced back, not in any disorder. They withdrew slowly and deliberately in perfect formation, the way a force moves when it has reached the edge of its own competence and knows it, and the only professional thing left to do is to stop and regroup and file an honest report. The fleet admiral's report was thorough and precise, the work of an experienced officer who had seen a great deal and knew how to document what he had seen. The final recommendation field, where mandate action officers are expected to advise on next steps, read full strategic reassessment of Terra class, threat evaluation, and then below it in a section that was not part of the standard format that he had added to the document himself. This species does not require authorization to act in unified purpose. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I forwarded the report to Owen with one note attached. I said, "Save this one." The Arbiter's private communication came through 37 minutes after the fleet's withdrawal was logged in the official record. Not a formal diplomatic channel, a private line, the kind used for conversations that do not appear in official records. I answered it. His voice came through without the 3-tone resonance, single register, smaller than I had ever heard it. "What do you want?" he said. 4 words, no formality, no procedural preamble, the question you ask when you have run every other approach and the only thing remaining is the honest one. I thought about 11 years in a slightly smaller chair. I thought about 900 diplomatic exchanges, 400 filed missions, 14 formal apologies on behalf of a civilization that had nothing to apologize for. I thought about Vera Cruz. I thought about the 4 words in Leon Archer's transit form and 400 others like it, and 38,000 ships full of ordinary people who had simply decided they were not going to watch. "Start over," I said. A long silence. "Define your terms," the Arbiter said. The framework I filed, 214 pages, read. Some of those provisions represent significant restructuring of council operations. "Yes," I said, "they do. Implementation will take years." "Yes," I said, "it will." Another silence, longer. "You are serious," he said. "I have always been serious," I said. "You just never tested that." The line stayed open for a moment. Then he said something I have not told many people because it sounds improbable until you have spent enough time understanding the Velhari to know that they only say certain things when they mean them completely. He said, "I did not believe your civilization was capable of this kind of patience." I said, "That is because you only looked at our warships." He closed the line. I sat in my office at orbital threshold and looked at the stars outside the viewport for a long time. The same stars I had looked at for 11 years, the same stars that every person in that merchant wall had been looking at their whole lives, working their routes and hauling their cargo and building their ordinary days. They had catalogued our warships, our weapon signatures, our military crew, numbers, all the loud things, everything that announces itself. They had never catalogued the silence, the 9 years of unfiled answers, the 47 hours of procedural architecture, built entirely from their own rules, the 14 seconds it took to rebuild a channel lock that should not have been possible, the 4 words written by 38,000 people who had arrived at the same 4 words independently because they were that kind of species. I picked up my pen. I started preparing for the summit. The council chamber was built for 17. They added the 18th seat overnight. I know because I was awake when the installation was done and watched it on the facility feed, 2 Velhari technicians working in the small hours of the station's night cycle. And I looked at the finished result on the feed for a long time before I got up and began preparing for the day. The seat was slightly smaller than the others, not dramatically, not in a way that would register to someone not specifically measuring 3 cm in seat height, 5 in backrest, the kind of difference that requires attention to notice. I have always paid attention. I walked into the chamber that morning with Owen Clark behind me and Carmen Voss and Felix Ward behind him. I walked to the 18th seat, the one with my name in front of it, and I sat down. I did not move it. I did not measure it aloud. I did not remark on it to Owen or Carmen or anyone else. I watched every delegation in the room. Noticed that I had noticed. No one said anything. The things nobody says are often the most important part of any conversation. The chamber looked the way it always had, curved table wide enough that the delegations at opposite ends could not have reached each other. Harmonic resonator panels translating 17 communication methods in the ceiling. Small lights at each seat showing active channel status. The Velhari delegation in their traditional 3 formation, the arbiter, centered, his posture carrying the weight of someone who has run this room for longer than any human civilization, has maintained continuous written records. He looked different today, not in appearance, in the way he held the weight, something in the arrangement of his posture that I had not seen before. The Velhari are not physically expressive in the way humans are, but I had spent 11 years learning to read the small things, the slight shifts that carry the information their words do. Not, he was tired. Not physically, the other kind, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long without setting it down. I recognized it because I had been carrying something similar in my own way for 11 years, and I had set it down, partially in a 4-hour and 27-minute reading session 2 days ago, and I knew what the weight felt like and what its absence felt like. I set my document case on the table and placed the printed framework on the surface in front of me. 214 pages, clean cover page, no decorative elements, just the title, the date, and the words in response to Resolution 7741. Omega. The arbiter opened the formal session. He began with an apology. In Velhari tradition, an apology has 7 clauses. Each one acknowledges a Specific harm named clearly in ascending order of severity. It is the most structured and formal expression of accountability in their culture, and an arbiter has delivered one publicly only, twice in the council's entire recorded history. The first was 400 years ago, the second was now. He delivered all 7 clauses. He did not rush any of them. I listened to every word. I thought about H. Wang Jiasu, age 44. Station physician, the kind of doctor who remembered her patients' names. Probably good at the kind of work that required patience and care and showing up every day. When the arbiter finished, I accepted the apology. I accepted it the way you accept a debt that has been formally acknowledged and is now part of the official record, completely without performance, without gratitude, and without coldness. Then I said, shall we begin? The first 3 hours covered procedural ground. The arbiter's delegation had reviewed the framework's opening 40 pages before the session and arrived with prepared responses to the most significant structural proposals. The responses were substantive, thoughtful, the kind of engagement that tells you the other party has read the material carefully and taken it seriously. Owen made small notations in his pad beside me, good ones from the angle I could see them. The Solari delegate raised the first major challenge at hour 3. Several of the framework's core reform provisions required a 2-3 majority vote to implement, he said, and achieving that majority would require persuading member governments who had supported Resolution 7741. Omega. He was not being obstructionist, he was being accurate. Yes, I said, it will require that. You believe it is achievable. I believe it is necessary, I said. Whether it is achievable depends on whether this council functions the way its charter says it does, or whether the charter is decoration. A pause. That is a direct challenge, the Solari delegate said. Yes, I said, it is. The arbiter looked at me for a long moment, then said, continue. At hour 5, the question of oversight came to the table, not mandate. Enforcement, the other kind. The kind that makes a reform framework real, rather than aspirational. The Kasari delegate asked who would oversee compliance with the new provisions. An independent tribunal, I said. Non-council composed of representatives from non-aligned civilizations, rotated every 4 years. No member serving consecutive terms. The council has never accepted external oversight, the arbiter said. No, I said, it has not. That is a fundamental change to how this body operates. Yes, I said, it is. The chamber went quiet in the way rooms. Do when everyone present is thinking at the same time, not the silence of reluctance, the silence of processing. Owen passed me a note. It said, Seth is nodding. I glanced left. The Seth delegate was in the harmonic equivalent of a sustained nod, a particular rhythm the resonator identifies as agreement. I looked back at the arbiter. He was reading the framework document. I let him read. There is a technique in long diplomatic negotiations that no school teaches, because it cannot be taught, the art of letting silence do the work, saying the difficult thing clearly without softening it afterward, and then stopping, no follow-up, no elaboration. Nothing for the other party to argue against, instead of thinking about what you actually said. I had learned it in year 3 of my posting in a cargo lane dispute that lasted 11 weeks. I had learned it by watching the arbiter use it on me. He read for 4 minutes. Then he said, "We will need to review the tribunal provisions in detail." "Of course," I said. "The composition requirements will be contested." "I expect so. This will not be a short process." "No," I said, "it will not." He looked up from the document, his 4 visual receptors oriented toward me in the Valhari configuration. That means complete focused attention, the kind you give to something you are genuinely trying to understand. You are prepared for a long process. He said, "I have been waiting 11 years for this conversation." I said, "I can wait longer." The pressure in the room changed. It was not a sound or a visible movement. It was more like an atmospheric shift, the kind you feel in a space when a fundamental assumption changes and everyone present recognizes it at the same moment. At hour 7, we broke for a recess, listed as 30 minutes that ran to 52. I sat in the anteroom with Owen, Carmen, and Felix and ate a compressed grain bar from the emergency stores Owen had packed because we had been too busy preparing documents to arrange a proper meal. I ate the whole thing, and it was the worst thing I had tasted in months. Carmen said, "How do you think it is going?" "Better than expected," I said. Owen said, "That is not saying much, given the baseline expectation we started with." Felix said, "I thought baseline expectations were medium." Owen said, "Felix, your expectations are always medium. It is a consistent trait." Felix opened his mouth, thought about it, and closed it again. I laughed, the real kind, the kind that arrives before you decide to let it. I could not remember the last time I had laughed in this building. We went back in. At hour 9, the first real opening came. The Pelhari delegate, whose government held 3 of the 17 council seats and had historically voted with the Valhari on security classifications, raised a question about the framework's classification review provision, whether the independent tribunal would have authority to reverse existing classifications, whether that included classifications currently in effect. "Yes," I said, "and yes." He looked at the arbiter looked at the framework document. Then the Pelhari delegate said, "My government's preliminary review finds the classification review provision consistent with our original understanding of the Accord's purpose. The Accord was written to facilitate cooperation between civilizations, not to establish permanent hierarchies of permission. We believe this framework is closer to that founding purpose than the current structure." The arbiter's head moved slightly. In Valhari expression, that particular movement is the equivalent of a raised eyebrow. He did not explain further. He did not need to. On the 5th day, the preliminary vote was held. 12 in favor, 3 abstentions, 2 against. 12 was enough to begin the implementation process. I did not stand. I did not raise my hands. I sat in my slightly smaller chair and looked at the vote count on the display and let myself have 4 seconds of something that was not quite relief and not quite victory, and was probably the closest thing to peace I was going to get in a moment like this. Then I said to Owen, "Start drafting the implementation notifications." He was already typing. On the final day before the official Closing statements, the arbiter asked to speak with me alone. We met in a small anteroom off the main chamber, just the two of us, no translation staff, because the arbiter spoke serviceable standard form English, and had for years. He had simply never used it in official sessions. Official sessions required official languages. He stood in the middle of the room. I stood near the door. He said, I made an error in judgment. Not the classification, which was a collective decision. I mean the 9 years. The inquiry you submitted, I was aware of it. I chose not to prioritize it. I know, I said. You have known for some time. Yes. And you continued submitting it. Regardless. Every year, I said, on the same date. He looked at me for a long time. 4. Visual receptors oriented in the configuration that in Velhari expression means something close to what humans call genuine respect, not the diplomatic kind, the kind that means you have revised your understanding of a person. I did not believe your civilization was capable of this kind of patience, he said. You measured our warships, I said. Our warships are not the most patient part of us. He made a sound. Low register, single tone. It took me a moment to identify it. It was the Velhari equivalent of a quiet laugh. No, he said, I see that now. We stood in the anteroom for another minute without speaking, which is its own kind of diplomatic communication. And then he said, the 18th seat. Yes, I said. It was an error, not deliberate. Specifications were taken from standard observer seating. No one thought to correct them. I looked at him for a moment. I know, I said. You said nothing. No, I said. You intended to raise it at the right moment. I intended to let it be part of the record, I said, as a data point about the kinds of things that happen without deliberate intent and what they communicate regardless. He was quiet. You are very good at your job, he said. Yes, I said, I am. I took the seat back with me when I left. Not as a symbol physically. I had the facility staff remove it from the chamber floor, crate it, and ship it to orbital threshold. When it arrived, I had it bolted to the floor of my office, in the corner where I could see it from my desk every day. Owen noticed it a week later. He stood in my doorway looking at the chair in the corner, then at me, then at the chair again. Is that from the summit chamber? He said. Yes, I said. He thought about it. Why, he said. I looked at the chair, smaller than it should be by 3 cm in the seat, 5 in the backrest, perfectly ordinary looking. If you were not measuring the kind of thing that goes unnoticed by people who are not paying attention. In 10 years, I said, a new diplomat is going to come through this office. Probably someone young, someone who has been working towards something for a long time and has finally gotten somewhere. They are going to sit in that chair while they wait for me, and they are going to notice something is slightly off, and they are going to ask me what it is. And what will you tell them? Owen said. I will tell them that the table you are invited to and the table you are owed are 2 different tables, I said, and that knowing which one you are sitting at before you say thank you is the most important thing this job teaches. Owen looked at the chair for a moment. That is a good lesson, he said. It was a long one, I said. He nodded, turned to leave. Owen. He stopped. Good work on all of it. He did the small contained smile, the kind that lives just under the surface. "You too," he said and walked out. I turned back to my desk, new filings, new route negotiations, the work that comes after, which is always the longer work. Anyone can fight for something. The discipline is in building it, page by page, provision by provision, name by name. On my desk, beside the new filings, was a printed copy of the Merchant Walls fleet log that Garner had sent for the historical record. 38,000 ships there. Routes, their crews, their forward transit applications. At the back was a page Garner had clipped and flagged. A scan of Leon Archer's original transit form in the purpose field in his own handwriting, 4 words. "Not going to watch." I read it once. Then I set it down face up on the corner of my desk, where it stays to this day. 11 years of patience. 38,000 people who chose. 214 names, now in the permanent record of the Galactic Council, retrievable and unremovable and impossible to call acceptable attrition anymore. I picked up the new filings and got back to work. That dog had always hunted. They just had not been watching the right field.